In the summer of 1942, a small, humid island in the South Pacific suddenly became one of the most important places on Earth. The island was called Guadalcanal, part of the Solomon Islands chain. At first glance, it looked insignificant, covered in dense jungle, surrounded by coral reefs, and home to only a few scattered villages. But in the middle of World War II, geography could decide the fate of nations. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal could threaten the sea routes between the United States and Australia, and whoever controlled those sea routes could shape the entire Pacific War. Only a few months earlier, the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. Since December 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, Japan had launched a massive wave of offensives across the Pacific. In a matter of months, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and large parts of New Guinea. Their navy dominated the seas, and their army advanced across island after island with astonishing speed. To many observers in early 1942, it looked as if Japan might control the entire Western Pacific. Their strategy was simple but effective. By capturing islands and building airfields, they could create a defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles across the ocean. Inside this perimeter, Japanese bases and aircraft would make it extremely dangerous for Allied ships to approach. Any attempt by the United States to push westward would be met by waves of aircraft, submarines, and heavily fortified islands. Guadalcanal became part of this plan almost quietly. In mid-1942, Japanese engineers arrived on the island and began clearing land for an airfield near a place called Lunga Point. At the time, the construction work seemed routine, but if completed, that airfield would allow Japanese bombers to patrol the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. And whoever controlled those sea routes could shape the entire Pacific War. American intelligence soon realized what was happening. Reconnaissance flights spotted the growing airstrip carved out of the jungle. The implications were alarming. If Japan finished that base, it would become much harder for the United States to reinforce Australia and New Zealand, two critical partners in the Pacific War effort. For American military planners, this moment forced a difficult decision. Up to this point in the war, the United States had mostly been reacting to Japanese moves. The attack on Pearl Harbor had thrown the nation into a defensive posture. But now there was a chance to strike back before the Japanese position became too strong. In Washington, naval and military leaders debated the risks. The United States was still mobilizing its massive industrial power, but many of its forces were not yet fully prepared. Launching a major offensive so early in the war was dangerous. If the operation failed, it could damage American morale and give Japan even greater control over the Pacific. Yet waiting was also dangerous. Every day that passed allowed Japanese engineers to expand the airfield on Guadalcanal. Soon, bombers could be operating there, turning the island into a powerful forward base. Eventually, the decision was made. The United States would strike first. The mission was given to the United States Marine Corps. Their objective was bold but simple: land on Guadalcanal, seize the unfinished airfield, and hold the island long enough for American forces to build their own defensive base there. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the invasion began. Hundreds of ships appeared off the coast of Guadalcanal. Warships, transport vessels, and landing craft filled the waters. For the Marines packed inside the landing boats, this moment felt historic. It was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. As the landing craft approached the beaches, many Marines expected fierce resistance. After all, Japanese forces had developed a reputation for defending territory with extreme determination. But something unexpected happened. The beaches were almost silent. The Japanese construction crews and small guard units on Guadalcanal were completely surprised. When the first waves of Marines stormed ashore, there was little organized resistance. Some Japanese soldiers fled into the jungle, while others attempted small, scattered attacks. Within hours, American forces had secured the immediate area around Lunga Point. For the Marines, the biggest prize was the half-completed airfield. The Japanese engineers had already done much of the hard work, clearing trees, leveling the ground, and laying the basic structure of the runway. When the Marines captured it, they immediately realized its importance. If they could finish this airfield themselves, it would allow American fighters and bombers to operate directly from Guadalcanal. The airfield would soon be renamed Henderson Field in honor of a Marine aviator killed earlier in the war. But at that moment, it was simply a strategic treasure sitting in the middle of the jungle. Despite the successful landing, the Marines knew the battle was far from over. The Japanese command would not allow such an important island to fall without a fight. Reinforcements would come by ship, by submarine, and possibly by aircraft, and the jungle surrounding the Marine perimeter offered endless hiding places for enemy troops. The first signs of this danger appeared almost immediately. Small groups of Japanese soldiers began to probe the Marine lines at night. The jungle echoed with strange sounds, rustling leaves, distant footsteps, occasional bursts of gunfire. Many Marines were fighting in tropical conditions for the first time. The heat was suffocating. Rainstorms turned the ground into mud. Mosquitoes swarmed through the camps, and the dense jungle made visibility almost impossible. In this environment, even a small enemy patrol could appear suddenly out of the darkness. Early skirmishes between American and Japanese troops were brief but intense. A few shots would ring out in the night, followed by the chatter of machine guns. Sometimes the attackers disappeared back into the jungle before Marines could even see them clearly. Other times the clashes turned into brutal, close-range firefights. Both sides were still trying to understand the other. Japanese commanders believed they were facing only a limited American force that could be quickly driven into the sea. The Marines, on the other hand, were preparing for the possibility of large counterattacks. But one thing was already becoming clear. This small island, which had once seemed unimportant, was about to become the center of a massive struggle. Ships, aircraft, and thousands of soldiers from both nations would soon converge on Guadalcanal. The battle would stretch across jungles, rivers, beaches, and the dark waters surrounding the island. And in the weeks ahead, the fighting would grow so intense that some Japanese soldiers would begin to believe something almost impossible, that the American Marines defending Guadalcanal seemed to have ammunition that never ran out. The first days after the landings on Guadalcanal were strangely quiet. For the Marines who had stormed the beaches expecting a brutal fight, the silence felt almost unsettling. They had captured the unfinished airfield and secured a defensive perimeter, but everyone understood the reality of the situation. The Japanese Empire had not yet truly responded. Somewhere beyond the jungle and the surrounding seas, enemy forces were already preparing to strike back. The Marines worked quickly. Every hour mattered. The captured airfield at Lunga Point became the center of all activity. Engineers and Seabees cleared debris, repaired damaged equipment, and extended the runway that Japanese construction crews had abandoned during the invasion. Bulldozers pushed through the tropical soil, while Marines stood guard with rifles and machine guns pointed toward the dark jungle. Soon the airstrip began to take shape. What had been a half-built Japanese project was turning into an American base. When the runway became operational, American fighter aircraft began landing there, giving the Marines something they desperately needed: air support directly from the island. But Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield of machines and strategy. It was also a battle against the environment itself. The jungle was dense, humid, and unforgiving. Temperatures climbed high during the day, and the heavy tropical air made every movement exhausting. At night, sudden rainstorms flooded trenches and soaked equipment. Mosquitoes spread disease, and the constant dampness caused weapons and gear to rust quickly. For many Marines, this was the first time fighting in such conditions. Visibility in the jungle could drop to just a few meters. Thick vegetation swallowed sound and movement. A soldier could be only a short distance away and remain completely hidden. Japanese troops quickly began using this environment to their advantage. Small groups of Japanese soldiers slipped through the jungle, studying Marine positions and testing their defenses. They moved silently through the trees, often approaching the American perimeter under the cover of darkness. These patrols were not yet full attacks. Instead, they were probing actions meant to discover weaknesses. The Marines soon realized that night on Guadalcanal belonged to the enemy. Japanese soldiers were highly trained in night operations. They were skilled at moving quietly and coordinating attacks in darkness. The first real clash came near a shallow stream known as the Tanadu River, though technically it was more of a sandbar lagoon than a true river. Japanese command believed the American force on Guadalcanal was still small and vulnerable. Confident that a quick assault could destroy the Marines before they became fully established, a Japanese detachment was sent to attack the American perimeter. Late at night, Japanese soldiers advanced toward the Marine lines. The jungle around the Tanadu River was dark and tense. Marines stood behind defensive positions built from sandbags, logs, and hastily dug trenches. Heavy machine guns were placed to cover the open ground leading to the riverbank. The Marines knew something was coming, but they did not know exactly when or where the attack would begin. Suddenly, in the darkness, movement appeared across the river. Japanese soldiers charged forward in a coordinated assault, shouting as they crossed the shallow water. Their plan was to break through the Marine defenses quickly and overwhelm the Americans in close combat. But the Marines were ready. When the attackers reached the open ground, American machine guns opened fire. The night exploded with noise. Long bursts of automatic fire tore across the riverbank. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness like glowing lines. Rifles cracked from defensive positions, while mortars launched shells into the advancing formations. For the Japanese soldiers caught in the open, the effect was devastating. Wave after wave attempted to push forward, but each charge ran into the same wall of firepower. Marine machine gunners maintained steady streams of bullets, cutting through the attackers before they could reach the defensive line. The sound of the guns echoed across the jungle, a relentless mechanical roar. Some Japanese troops managed to reach the sandbar, trying to crawl forward under the gunfire. Others attempted to flank the Marine positions through the jungle, but the defenders had overlapping fields of fire. Every approach was covered. As the battle continued through the night, the riverbank became a deadly zone. The Marines held their ground, while Japanese forces struggled to advance against the intense defensive fire. By morning, the outcome was clear. The attack had failed. For the Marines, the battle was their first major ground engagement on Guadalcanal, and it proved something important. Their defensive positions, combined with disciplined use of machine guns and rifles, could stop even determined assaults. But for many Japanese soldiers who survived the battle, the experience left a powerful impression. The volume of American gunfire seemed overwhelming. Machine guns fired continuously, rifles cracked from every direction, and mortar shells landed again and again. To soldiers advancing across the river in the darkness, it felt as if the Americans had an endless supply of ammunition. Stories began spreading among Japanese units that the Marines on Guadalcanal possessed enormous stockpiles of bullets. Some soldiers even believed American machine guns could fire almost without stopping. Of course, the reality was more complicated. The Marines were carefully managing their ammunition, and supply ships were already bringing more resources to the island. But in the chaos of battle, perception could be as powerful as truth.
As Japanese survivors retreated back into the jungle, they carried with them memories of the terrifying wall of fire they had faced. Those stories would travel through the ranks of Japanese forces arriving on the island. And as the days passed, more troops from both sides continued to arrive on Guadalcanal. The island was transforming into a battlefield of growing intensity. The jungle that once hid small patrols and skirmishes would soon witness much larger battles, because for the Japanese command, the defeat near the Tanadu River was only the beginning. Reinforcements were already being organized, and new attacks were being planned. The next assaults would be larger, more coordinated, and far more desperate. And with every new battle, the reputation of the Marines' relentless firepower would grow stronger.
By late summer of 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had entered a new phase. The quiet tension of the first days was gone. Now the island echoed almost constantly with gunfire, aircraft engines, and distant explosions. What had begun as a surprise American landing was turning into a brutal struggle for survival. At the center of this struggle stood the Marine defensive perimeter around Henderson Field. This airfield had quickly become the most important piece of ground on the island. As long as American aircraft could operate from Henderson Field during the day, Japanese ships had difficulty approaching Guadalcanal. Fighter planes and dive bombers from the airfield constantly threatened any vessels attempting to reinforce Japanese troops. Because of this, Japanese commanders made Henderson Field their primary target. If they could capture it, they could restore their control of the skies and turn the island back into a powerful base for their own forces. But taking the airfield meant breaking through the Marine defenses surrounding it. The Marines had spent days strengthening their perimeter. Defensive lines stretched through jungle clearings, along ridges, and across open ground that attackers would have to cross. Sandbags, foxholes, and log bunkers were carefully positioned to support each other. Most importantly, the Marines placed their heavy machine guns where they could dominate likely approaches. These weapons would soon become the defining sound of the battlefield. Marine machine gun teams worked with almost mechanical discipline. Each team had specific roles. One Marine operated the gun itself, another fed the ammunition belt, and others carried spare barrels, ammunition boxes, and water for cooling. These were not weapons fired randomly. Every burst was controlled, every target carefully chosen. When Japanese forces began probing the perimeter again, they quickly discovered just how deadly these positions were. Japanese tactics relied heavily on aggressive infantry attacks. Soldiers were trained to advance quickly, close the distance with the enemy, and overwhelm defensive lines through determination and courage. In many earlier campaigns across Asia and the Pacific, these tactics had been highly effective. But Guadalcanal presented a different challenge. To reach the Marine lines, Japanese attackers often had to cross narrow jungle clearings, ridgelines, or shallow riverbeds. These spaces created deadly fields of fire. Machine gunners waited silently as enemy soldiers approached through the darkness or vegetation. Then, at exactly the right moment, the guns opened up. The sound was unmistakable. A deep, steady rhythm of automatic fire tore through the air. Tracer rounds streaked across the battlefield, cutting through the night like glowing threads. The dense jungle amplified every burst, making the firing seem even more overwhelming. For Japanese soldiers advancing toward the Marine lines, it felt as though the Americans had guns everywhere. But the effectiveness of Marine firepower did not come only from the weapons themselves. It came from preparation and coordination. Machine guns were positioned so that multiple guns could cover the same area. If one gun paused or shifted targets, another immediately continued firing. Riflemen and automatic rifle gunners supported these positions as well, creating layers of defensive fire. Behind the lines, ammunition carriers worked constantly. Wooden boxes filled with belts of machine gun rounds were stacked in trenches and bunkers. Whenever a gun team began to run low, another Marine would crawl forward with a fresh box. It was exhausting work. The tropical heat drained energy quickly, and the weight of ammunition boxes made every movement difficult. Yet these supply efforts ensured that the machine guns rarely fell silent during attacks. For Japanese troops observing these battles, the effect was deeply confusing. During night assaults, attackers often heard machine guns firing continuously for long periods. Every attempt to move forward triggered another burst of fire. Even when one gun stopped, another seemed to start immediately from a different direction. Some Japanese soldiers began to believe the Americans possessed an almost impossible advantage. Rumors spread that the Marines had brought enormous quantities of ammunition to the island. Others claimed that American supply ships were constantly delivering more. To soldiers facing these defensive lines, it seemed as though the Americans could fire endlessly. In reality, the Marines were carefully managing every round. Guadalcanal was still a dangerous place for supply convoys. Japanese naval forces controlled the waters around the island at night, often sending fast destroyers to deliver troops and supplies to their own forces. These nighttime missions became known among American troops as the Tokyo Express. Because of this threat, American supply ships could not always approach safely. Some deliveries were delayed, and at times the Marines worried about their stockpiles. Yet American logistics still held an advantage. Whenever U.S. naval forces managed to bring supplies ashore, they delivered large quantities of ammunition, food, and equipment. American industry, thousands of miles away, was producing weapons and ammunition at an enormous scale. Even in the difficult conditions of Guadalcanal, the Marines benefited from that industrial strength. For Japanese soldiers who had marched through the jungle carrying limited ammunition, the difference was striking. Some Japanese units had strict limits on how much ammunition each soldier could carry. Machine gun teams often had far fewer rounds than their American counterparts. As battles continued, these shortages became more noticeable. The psychological impact of this difference began to shape the battlefield. Japanese attackers sometimes hesitated when advancing toward Marine machine gun positions, remembering earlier assaults where intense fire had cut down entire groups of soldiers. Survivors described the experience to newly arriving troops, warning them about the relentless American guns. Stories spread quickly through the ranks. Some soldiers claimed that American machine guns never seemed to run dry. Others insisted the Marines had stockpiles of ammunition so that they could fire all night without stopping. Whether these beliefs were entirely accurate did not matter. What mattered was that many Japanese soldiers began entering battle expecting to face overwhelming firepower. And on Guadalcanal, that expectation was often confirmed. Night after night, small clashes and sudden firefights erupted along the Marine perimeter. Patrols encountered each other in the darkness. Flares lit up the jungle canopy for brief moments, revealing silhouettes moving through the trees. Then the machine guns would begin again. The steady, hammering rhythm of automatic fire became a constant presence on the island. As the weeks passed, both sides continued sending reinforcements. More Japanese troops arrived under cover of darkness, while American forces strengthened their defensive lines around Henderson Field. Everyone knew that larger battles were coming. Japanese command was preparing a major offensive designed to break the Marine perimeter once and for all. Thousands of troops were gathering for the attack. Their objective was simple but desperate: capture Henderson Field and drive the Americans off Guadalcanal. When that assault began, the jungle would erupt into one of the most intense battles of the campaign. By September and October of 1942, the struggle for Guadalcanal had turned into a relentless cycle of preparation, attack, and survival. Both sides now understood that the island was far more important than anyone had first imagined. What had begun as a surprise American landing had evolved into one of the most brutal and exhausting battles of the Pacific War. The Marines defending the perimeter around Henderson Field knew that the Japanese would not stop trying to capture it. The airfield had become the heart of the entire campaign. As long as American aircraft operated from its runway during daylight hours, Japanese ships could not safely approach the island in large numbers. That meant Japanese reinforcements had to arrive mostly at night, often carried by fast destroyers racing down from northern bases. American troops began calling these nighttime supply runs the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers would appear suddenly in the darkness, unload troops and supplies as quickly as possible, and then disappear before dawn. These operations allowed Japan to keep sending soldiers to Guadalcanal, but they also created a problem. The destroyers could carry men quickly, but they could not transport large quantities of heavy equipment or ammunition. As a result, many Japanese soldiers arriving on the island carried limited supplies. They were expected to move fast, attack aggressively, and capture American positions before shortages became a serious problem. Japanese commanders believed that a powerful, coordinated assault could still break the Marine defenses. Throughout the jungle surrounding Henderson Field, thousands of Japanese troops quietly assembled for a major offensive. Officers studied maps, scouts examined American positions, and soldiers prepared for night attacks that would push directly into the Marine perimeter. Meanwhile, inside the defensive lines, the Marines continued strengthening their positions. Foxholes were deepened, machine gun nests were reinforced with sandbags and logs. Mortar crews carefully marked the ranges to likely approach routes through the jungle. Every Marine knew that the next attack might come at any moment. The tension was constant. During the day, American aircraft roared off Henderson Field, flying patrols and bombing Japanese positions across the island. But at night, the situation changed completely. Darkness belonged to the Japanese. Patrols moved silently through the jungle, searching for weak points in the Marine lines. Sometimes Marines could hear them before seeing them, footsteps in the brush, quiet whispers, or the faint click of equipment. Flares would suddenly burst into the sky, lighting the jungle in an eerie white glow. And then the shooting would begin. When the long-expected Japanese assaults finally came, they were fierce and determined. Columns of infantry pushed forward through the jungle, guided by officers who believed speed and courage could overwhelm the American defenses. But once again, the Marines had prepared their lines carefully. As Japanese soldiers moved into the open area surrounding the defensive perimeter, they encountered the same deadly obstacle that earlier attackers had faced. Marine machine guns opened fire with controlled, disciplined bursts. Rifles joined in. Mortar shells began falling behind the advancing troops, cutting off movement and creating chaos. The jungle night exploded with noise and light. Tracers streaked across the battlefield in bright arcs. The heavy thumping of machine guns echoed through the trees. Explosions from grenades and mortars shook the ground. For soldiers caught in the open, it was almost impossible to advance without facing intense fire. Japanese units tried again and again to break through. Some groups attempted to move quietly along ridges or through narrow jungle paths, hoping to reach the Marine lines before being detected. Others launched direct charges, rushing forward in desperate attempts to close the distance. Officers shouted orders, while soldiers pressed forward through smoke and darkness. But every movement seemed to trigger another storm of bullets. Marine gunners worked with relentless focus.
Ammunition belts fed into the weapons, while assistants prepared spare barrels and fresh boxes of rounds. Whenever a gun slowed or paused, another nearby position picked up the fire. The defenders had overlapping fields of fire designed to support each other. Attackers trying to avoid one machine gun often moved directly into the line of another. For Japanese soldiers, the experience was terrifying. Many had already heard stories from earlier battles about the volume of American gunfire. Now they were witnessing it themselves. The constant bursts of machine gun fire made it feel as though the Marines possessed endless ammunition reserves. Some attackers believed the Americans had prepared enormous stockpiles before the battle began. Others thought supply ships must be arriving constantly, delivering more ammunition to the island. From the perspective of soldiers advancing through darkness under heavy fire, it truly seemed as if the American guns never stopped. Yet the Marines themselves understood the reality. They were not firing carelessly. Machine gun teams controlled their bursts carefully to avoid overheating the barrels or wasting ammunition. Officers monitored the use of supplies closely, knowing that shortages could still become a serious problem if the battle dragged on. But even with these limitations, the Marines maintained one crucial advantage: organization. American defensive tactics emphasized coordination between weapons. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery all worked together to create layers of firepower. If attackers broke through one part of the line, nearby units could quickly shift their fire to stop them. Japanese forces often depended on the speed and determination of infantry charges. When those attacks ran into prepared defenses supported by heavy firepower, the results could be devastating. Again and again, Japanese assaults were pushed back from the Marine perimeter. By morning, the jungle in front of some defensive positions showed the brutal cost of these attacks. Survivors withdrew into the forest, carrying wounded comrades and reporting back to their commanders. The repeated failures created a growing sense of frustration among Japanese units. Many had expected the Americans to be exhausted, poorly supplied, or vulnerable to determined assaults. Instead, they found themselves facing defensive positions that seemed incredibly difficult to penetrate. And once again, the same explanation appeared in conversations among the troops. They said the Americans had far more ammunition than anyone could have imagined. Some even began to describe the Marine defenses in almost mythical terms. They claimed the machine guns fired without pause, as if the defenders had endless supply of bullets waiting behind their lines. But the reality of the battle was still unfolding. More Japanese reinforcements were arriving, and commanders were already planning new attacks. The struggle for Guadalcanal was far from decided. In fact, some of the most intense fighting of the entire campaign was still ahead. Because while the Marines had managed to hold their ground so far, the pressure on the island continued to grow. Japanese forces were determined to capture Henderson Field at any cost. And the next phase of the battle would test both sides even further, revealing the deeper truth behind the legend of the Marines' seemingly unlimited ammunition.
By late 1942, months of fighting had transformed Guadalcanal into one of the most brutal battlefields of the Pacific War. The jungle that once hid scattered patrols and sudden ambushes had witnessed repeated assaults, artillery bombardments, and desperate struggles for survival. Both sides had poured thousands of soldiers into the island, and the battle had become a test not only of courage, but of endurance, logistics, and industrial power. Among Japanese soldiers fighting on Guadalcanal, one strange belief had begun to spread through the ranks. Many were convinced that the American Marines defending the island had what seemed like unlimited ammunition. The idea had not appeared suddenly. It had grown slowly through months of combat. Survivors of early attacks described nights when machine guns fired almost continuously. They spoke about attempts to advance across open ground that were met with relentless bursts of automatic fire. To soldiers who had experienced those battles firsthand, it often felt as though the Marine guns simply never stopped. These stories passed from unit to unit. Newly arriving Japanese troops heard them from exhausted veterans who had already fought near the Marine defensive lines. Some soldiers dismissed the rumors at first, believing them to be exaggerations, but once they faced the Marine defenses themselves, many began to understand why those stories existed. The sound of American firepower was overwhelming. Machine guns fired with steady rhythm, rifles cracked from trenches and foxholes, mortar shells exploded behind advancing formations, cutting off movement and creating confusion. Whenever attackers attempted to regroup or shift direction, another burst of gunfire seemed to appear from a different position. In the darkness of the jungle, it created the impression that the Marines possessed endless supplies of ammunition. But behind the myth was a more complicated reality. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not firing without limits. In fact, during the early stages of the campaign, American forces sometimes worried about their own supply situation. Japanese naval forces dominated the waters around the island at night, and several American supply ships had already been forced to withdraw during earlier naval battles. For a time, the Marines were left with whatever supplies had already been unloaded. Food became scarce, medical supplies were limited, ammunition had to be used carefully. Officers reminded their men constantly to fire only when necessary and to conserve their rounds for moments when the enemy was clearly visible. Yet even under those conditions, American logistics held an important advantage. Far across the Pacific Ocean, the industrial capacity of the United States was already transforming the war. Factories were producing enormous quantities of weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition. Cargo ships loaded with supplies crossed thousands of miles of ocean to support the war effort. Whenever American naval forces secured temporary control of the waters around Guadalcanal, those supply ships rushed forward to unload everything they could: crates of rifle ammunition, belts of machine gun rounds, mortar shells, fuel, and food. Each successful convoy strengthened the Marine defenses. Over time, the situation gradually shifted. As the months passed, American naval power in the region grew stronger. Warships began escorting supply convoys more effectively, and aircraft from Henderson Field attacked Japanese ships approaching the island during daylight hours. The balance of the campaign slowly began to change. Meanwhile, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal faced a very different situation. The same destroyers that carried reinforcements during nighttime Tokyo Express missions could not transport large amounts of heavy equipment or supplies. Soldiers arriving on the island often carried limited ammunition and rations, expecting that the battle would be decided quickly. But the battle was not decided quickly. Instead, the campaign dragged on week after week. As supply shortages grew worse, Japanese troops began struggling with hunger, disease, and lack of equipment. Ammunition became precious, artillery shells were limited, even basic food supplies ran dangerously low. Under these conditions, the contrast between the two sides became more obvious. Japanese soldiers fighting against Marine defenses sometimes fired carefully measured shots as they advanced. Meanwhile, Marine machine guns answered with long, controlled bursts. To exhausted attackers already dealing with shortages, the difference felt enormous. This contrast helped strengthen the belief that the Americans possessed almost unlimited ammunition. In truth, what the Japanese soldiers were witnessing was not magic or exaggeration. It was the power of logistics and industrial production combined with defensive tactics. The Marines used their weapons carefully, but they also benefited from a supply system that could eventually deliver enormous quantities of material across the ocean.
Guadalcanal became one of the first battles in the Pacific where this difference clearly revealed itself. As the campaign continued, Japanese commanders gradually realized that capturing the island might no longer be possible. Repeated assaults had failed to break the marine perimeter, supply shortages were growing worse, disease and exhaustion weakened the troops who remained. Finally, after months of fighting, Japanese leadership made a difficult decision. They would evacuate their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. In early 1943, under the cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers returned to the island once again, but this time they were not bringing reinforcements. Instead, they were carrying soldiers away, withdrawing the surviving troops who had endured the long campaign. For the Marines who had defended the island, the evacuation marked the end of one of the hardest battles of the war. Guadalcanal had been more than just a fight for a small tropical island. It had been a turning point in the Pacific. For the first time, Japanese expansion had been stopped and reversed. The initiative in the war was beginning to shift towards the United States and its allies. And among many memories carried by soldiers who survived the battle, one story continued to circulate. Japanese veterans would later describe the terrifying nights when Marine machine guns seemed to fire without pause, when every advance was met with another wall of bullets, and when it felt as though the defenders possessed ammunition that would never run out. The truth, of course, was more complex, but on the dark battlefields of Guadalcanal, surrounded by jungle and gunfire, it was easy to understand how such a legend began.